Okay, so here we have a piece of velvet. When you sew with velvet, there's a couple tools that might make your life a little bit easier that you might not think of. One of them is a sticky lint roller. Velvet picks up everything. It's picking up little fuzzies from previous projects I've worked on, and I often find where you cut it, it will fray and leave little pieces like this all around. So you want to keep one of these handy. So velvet, we call this the fuzzy part, we call that the nap. So when you cut your pieces, you really want to make sure you don't have one piece running up and down this way, and don't flip your pattern over kind of the other way and have one running up and one running down. It will end up looking funny. You need to make sure that the top of your fabric, here's our selvage edge, like you want to make sure that everything is lined up, all going the same direction. Yeah, like you don't want one sleeve going this way and the other sleeve going the other way, because when it hangs, the fabric will look a little bit different depending on the direction of what we call the nap. Before you begin, you, depending on your fabric, it might look different than mine. You may decide that one direction looks a bit nicer than the other one. So whatever you end up deciding, make sure you keep it consistent. So what a tip I like to do is, I'm just going to cut out 2 rectangles, but I'm going to, yeah, look how much lint there is here. What I like to do is draw arrows in the direction of my fabric. So I know that this is up, okay? I don't want one arrow when I cut it to be up and the other one to be down. They're both going to be up. That way it's the same direction. Velvet is also a little bit tricky to sew, so we're going to get into that in a minute. So I'm just going to cut out 2 rectangles just to demonstrate a few things. Okay, so I just cut out my 2 rectangles. So down here, this is what I said, like these little lint things will end up everywhere. So, okay. Now when I flip them over, you can see I have my arrows here, both pointing up. So I'm going to sew it, and I'm going to pin it together with regular pins, but I'm actually going to do an additional step. And not everyone does this, but I find when I am sewing velvet, what often happens, or sometimes some other materials that have a nap like this, that have this sort of texture, what can happen, which ends up getting kind of frustrating, is you'll pin it and everything will be perfectly even up here, but then the pile or the nap, it ends up shifting. It's like no matter what you do, it kind of creeps and nothing ends up being lined up. So what I do, it's one of those extra steps that can save you frustration later, is I will hand baste it. So I will if I find this happening, I will hand baste my seam. So I'm just using a needle and thread, and I'm using my thread in a contrasting color. So I'm just going to do a running stitch along here, and that will just keep my fabric together so it won't shift while I sew it. Hand basting is one of those things that can save you some frustration later. I will sometimes use it on slippery fabrics as well, or if something just doesn't seem to want to line up right, or if I'm really just testing an idea and I'm not really sure what I'm doing and I want to be able to take it out easier, then I'll do that as well. Okay, so now we are ready to stitch. All right, so we're ready to sew. We've got this basted together here, and I've just got my machine on regular settings. You can see a little bit here that as I sew between my basting stitches, the fabric's almost buckling up a little bit, but I am still sewing it flat. So if this wasn't basted together, it would be shifting, but the basting is holding it steady. Like right here, you can see there's almost a little bit of a bubble, but it will still sew down. I'm also going to hold it a bit more flat. So even with it basted, it's still even, the seam allowance shifted a little bit while I sewed. Like this was lined up better over there, but that's not too bad. Like that won't really cause you any real problems. So now we're going to press it, and you can't just press it the regular way. I'll show you a few tips. Okay, so I'm over here at the ironing board now, and first of all, I'm going to take out my basting stitches. It should be fairly easy to remove. If you sewed on top of them, it might be a little bit stuck, but it shouldn't be too bad. I like to do this before I press, just because it could affect how whether or not it lays perfectly flat. So I've got that pulled out now. So generally whenever you sew, you want to press your seams after. And typically you do that by pressing your seam flat when it's still right sides together, and then opening it up and pressing your seam allowance open in most cases. However, with velvet, if you do that, you will crush the pile, you'll crush the nap, and it will be smushed, and you'll be able to tell that it was ironed. So that's why I have a towel down here. You can get what is called a velvet pressing mat, and it has all these like bristles in it. However, if you don't have one of those, this is a workaround you can do. So I'm going to very carefully press in the seam allowance here. I'm not going to press over my whole fabric. Okay, and I was using steam as well. So opening it up, okay, it doesn't look like I smushed it too badly. So where I don't have a velvet pressing board, which has, yeah, it has a bunch of bristles in it, so this will help a little bit. So I'm going to go to press it open. Yeah, you don't want to be just pushing this hard and flat here, okay? Because yeah, you'll crush the pile of the fabric. So I have this over the towel so that the toweling will just sort of help some of the fibers from the velvet go in between, so it won't be completely flat. And I'm using a really light a light hand here. I'm not pushing it down. I'm using steam, and I'm really kind of barely touching it. But that did press it open. And there you go. That's not too bad. So again, we have all these fibers from our velvet here. But that is how you sew velvet. So hopefully if you try a velvet project, it will go a little bit easier from the tips that we learned today. And yes, these fibers make a mess, and I would make sure that you clean your machine on the inside according to your manual when you're done, because these linties will leave lots of fuzzies inside your machine.